Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today at the Haunted Cafe. My name is Amber, and today we are going to be talking about the haunted Boyington oak tree, which is located just outside of the Churchill Street graveyard in Mobile, Alabama. So grab a drink and a comfy chair, because we have a spooky tale to tell. But before we get started, we have a tea that I am going to be talking about. The tea that I have is another Stash brand, and it is salted caramel I think it's Mate, M-A-T-E, and it's an herbal and black tea. It has yerba mate, maybe it's mate. It has yerba mate, cocoa shells, black tea, monk fruit, and salted caramel flavor. It sounds really good, and if you want to try it yourself, there's a link down in the description box below. Every little bit helps the channel, so yeah, give it a try. So our story starts with a young man named Charles R.S. Boyington. He was a 23-year-old printer from New Haven, Connecticut. He was described as being 5 foot, 9 inches tall, with dark hair and a dark complexion. He arrived in Mobile, Alabama from Connecticut in November 1833. It was said that he bargained his way to Alabama on a steamboat, and he basically worked on the boat in trade for the ride to Mobile. He was known to have some troubles in the past with the law, and it was said that he was charged with horse stealing in Charleston, South Carolina, which just remember that, because that'll definitely come back up later. So when Charles arrived to Mobile, he got a job in Pollard and Dade's print shop. It was said that he lived in a bunch of different boarding houses, just kind of staying wherever he could due to Mobile's inflated living cost. Mobile was a very popular place for immigrants to run to, as they were looking for a place that was kind of rich in work and in jobs, and it seems like that the only people who were able to get rich or richer in Mobile were the ones that already had money to spend. Everything was just crazy expensive, and it was overpriced because there was such a high demand for stuff, but yeah, so later, when Charles was sitting in his jail cell, he is quoted as saying that his life had been an almost constant scene of adventures. Living in these temporary houses meant that Charles met a lot of different people from a lot of different walks of life. He met a lot of other printers, clerks, and laborers, and most, if not all of these people, ended up spending their free time at local pubs or gambling dens. He saw all these other workers doing these things, and Charles just kind of followed their lead and jumped headfirst into the gambling and the drinking. But at this point in time, it didn't really stop him from reaching out to the high society of Mobile. With Charles being a printer, he was seen as more of a respectable man that one of the high society could mingle with. At the time, higher class families were always throwing parties or fancy dinners, which meant that a lot of these parties or events required invitations. And so if your work as a printer was clean and nice, you were considered in a higher regard compared to other people at the time. And obviously that's kind of what happened to Charles. He must have been good at his work, because in December 1833, he was invited to a ball of a family he was close with, a high society family he was close with. There, he met a beautiful young lady named Rose de Fleur, whose father was a French Napoleonic War refugee. Rose de Fleur sounds just a really cool name, honestly. And after they met, an unconventional romance sparked. They began to write love letters and poetry to each other, as well as sneaking off for little secret walks. Um, of her father, of course, did not approve of this relationship at all, due to the fact that Charles was a lower status than Rose. But it didn't really seem to stop the two of them, you know? So they kept their secret romance up until, spoiler alert, Charles was hung. So, in 1834, Charles lost his job due to a decrease in business. Even when he was working at Pollard and Dade's printing service, he had only made about $100 with them over the wintertime, which I did like the calculations and stuff. And by today's standards, that's only around $3,500 to last a winter time. I think I would like to say, which, could be a little most of us make around $3,000 a month, but he made it during like a whole winter time, so it's definitely not a lot of money. And so he began to borrow money from his family up north, and he had won a few bets here and there, to keep the money going. But this just wasn't going to last forever, and he needed to think of something quick to keep up with his lifestyle, like, drinking, gambling, and, just the lifestyle. In May of 1834, Charles started to present himself as a higher class than what he actually was. It was said that he wore a dark olive dress coat, a dark satin pantaloons, and a double-breasted silk velvet vest. This outfit was really expensive, and it definitely took a huge chunk of money out of like whatever money he had left. And I'm sure that this was because he wanted to impress Rose and all the other high society people in his life. Honestly, if he stopped like drinking and gambling and stuff like that, he would have had money to last for a little while anyway. Like you would think, until he got something else. But also around this time, Charles began to write and publish poems in Mobile's mercantile advertisers, which I think is just like a newspaper. These poems were under the title Extracts from a Young Rambler's Portfolio. These poems included titles such as The Wanderer and The Misanthrope. In these writings, he's portraying a character who has gone through a lot of hardships, someone who has fought many battles, literal or not, and someone who does not care for love because he has been heartbroken in the past. The character is someone who's not like other guys, Surprisingly, a lot of young men actually liked his writing, and he began to gain popularity in the small town of Mobile. There was a problem, though. As much as he enjoyed writing these publications and all that, they just weren't really paying the bills at all. So it was at this point in time that he kind of started begging people for help with money and stuff like that. And he started even asking his friends. It was one man, George Williamson, who took Charles in a way. On April 30th, they became roommates at Captain William George's boarding house, and in exchange, Charles became Williamson's caretaker. And also living at this boarding house was a man named Nathaniel Frost. Nathaniel was also a printer, and he was also from the New England area, but sadly, he had tuberculosis, so he was very ill all of the time. Frost was a man who seemed to be kind of friendly to everyone, even if he wasn't trying to be. He just seemed to be a polite and courteous man, it was also said that he was well off, maybe not like overflowing with money, but he had enough to keep a roof over his head and food in his stomach. Um, Frost was not the gambling type, he just kind of seemed like he enjoyed the easy and peaceful life, which was the complete opposite of Charles. So, in a lot of articles, it is said that Charles Boyington was also Nathaniel Frost's caretaker, but that was not true at all, according to even Charles himself. He just said that he and Frost were really good friends. Um, they would just sit together and talk or read, and they probably had a decent amount in common due to the fact that they were both, from the north, and they were both printers. So they could talk to trade or talk about home life. Um, they even took long walks together, and Charles considered Nathaniel a very close friend, and hopefully Nathaniel thought Charles was a really good friend. We sadly don't know. um, so now, because Frost had a decent amount of money, people thought that Charles had possibly borrowed money from Frost, and in turn, he obviously owed that money back to him. Um, but I didn't really see anywhere where this actually was confirmed to be true or not, like that Charles owed money. Um, but it was also said that another man, Captain George, the landlord, actually owed Frost a lot of money. Um, this will come back up later again, so just keep that in your back pocket. While people noticed just how friendly Charles and Nathaniel were getting, it kind of made them question why Charles friended him in the first place. I feel like at this point, everyone knew that Charles was broke, and he had been gambling and begging a lot for money lately. People around them began to wonder if it was if Charles's motives were slightly like malicious, although they couldn't really be proven to be true. And this obviously was in an article after the murder. Um, Spoiler alert, Nathaniel is the one that passes away. So, I wonder if this is just something that kind of came up after the murder. Like, I wonder if after Nathaniel died, I wonder if everyone just kind of spread that rumor around. Like, oh, like an afterthought almost. Like, oh, that must have been why Charles was friends with him, because he wanted his money. But, it's something that can be brought up, but who knows how true it actually is. So, as spring continued forward, Charles's situation started to get worse and worse. In June, just a month away, he was planning a trip to New York to visit his family. But he owed a lot of money to a lot of different people. Charles really didn't have the funds to go see his family and also pay his debts in Mobile. It was said that at this time, one or more of his creditors were actually starting to prosecute him for not paying his debts back, which meant that, he would go to jail. Charles knew that if he was found guilty of not paying, or of even, not attempting to pay whatsoever, he would be thrown in jail, like I said. So he decided to leave Mobile and head back home. He said that he wanted to leave on May 1st, so he began to beg his friends up north for money for the trip, but unfortunately no answer ever came to him. Running out of options, Charles had to make a choice. He could either take a boat on the Alabama River to Montgomery and then to Georgia, traveling the rest of the way to the north on land. His second plan, which was a little bit more difficult, would have been to take a boat from New Orleans to the north. While the second ride was a lot cheaper, it was a lot longer, and the start of the journey would require Charles to take a stagecoach to New Orleans. And the problem with this is that the stagecoach depot was very close to his boarding house, and he was afraid that someone would see him leave town that way. So he told Williamson, his roommate, about these issues, and even mapped out the different routes in a red pocket map. Finally, on May 10th, he decided to go with the second route, so the boat to from New Orleans. Um, Only instead of leaving from the stagecoach depot near the house, he decided to ride a horse to Spring Hill and to catch a coach from that location. So, on this very same day, May 10th, Charles decided to go to a stable that was owned by a man named Mr. Smith and asked to buy a horse for the following day, May 11th. Everything with that deal seemed to be fine, and so Charles came back home to the boarding house where he met up with Nathaniel Frost. The two chatted and went together on a short walk on Dolphin Street, which, if you go onto Facebook or Instagram, you can see a map. And Dolphin Street is the light blue street that I have highlighted. Um, they then turned around and went back home, which is on Royal Street or the Green Street, somewhere on that road. And they decided to eat lunch together at about 1:30. They then decided to go sit on the front porch. They chatted, supposedly talking about their friends and probably maybe about Charles's issues. At some point in time after 3 o'clock, Nathaniel Frost decided to go inside. Charles, on the other hand, decided to leave Mobile that very day, and so he went to talk to Mr. Smith about the horse. Apparently, when he went to leave, Nathaniel Frost decided to join him for another walk. Supposedly, on their way out, Charles and Nathaniel stopped to talk to another resident, Miss Craigton, about picking blackberries in the Church Street Cemetery, which is the red circle on the map. And they decided to walk on Government Street, which is the purple line on the map, to get to that cemetery. Supposedly, that's where Frost and Boyington were heading. They made their way on Government Street towards the cemetery, and according to Charles Boyington's statement, he listened as Frost talked about his medical problems, and then he excused himself, turned around, and made his way back to Royal Street and back to Mr. Smith's stable. So according to Charles himself, it sounds like he didn't even go to the cemetery with Nathaniel. He just kind of maybe walked a little bit towards it and then turned around. First, when he arrived at the stable, he found out that the horse he rented had gone to the races that day and wouldn't be available until the next day. He then supposedly began walking around town, checking in at other stables to see if any other horses were available. But he didn't have any luck whatsoever. He then stopped at a coffee house to talk to a man named Reuben Vow. I don't know if this man was just a friend or maybe possibly a debt collector. The only reason why I bring this up is because right after this meeting, Charles headed back to Mr. Smith's stable. This time, Mr. Smith himself wasn't there, but he was able to try and ride a completely different horse than the one he rented. According to Charles himself, the horse rode like a rough, trotting beast, and so he turned around and returned the horse back to the stable. At this point in time, it was about 5 o'clock p.m., and Charles was defeated. He tried one more stable, but without success. So, on his way back home to the boarding house, Charles walked past the docks. And if you look at the map, Dolphin Street kind of lines up with the river. So, I'm assuming that, as Charles was walking down the road, he could probably, see the docks as he walked. And, as he walked down the road, he noticed a steamboat, which was called the James Monroe, getting ready to depart. Seeing this as his final chance, Charles ran for the boat, only to stop, to grab 2 pistols, which at first I was like, why did you stop to grab guns? But if you think about it, it's still technically the Wild West, it's still if you look at like a John Wayne movie, it's still technically that kind of like area, so it makes sense for him to stop and grab, something to protect himself before heading out. He supposedly talked to a few friends before he went onto the boat, made a deal with the captain, and was on board by the end of the night. So, uh, if you don't know, the next morning, on May 11th, the body of Nathaniel Frost was found near the Church Street Cemetery. He had been stabbed several times with his own knife that he had used to whittle. He had been robbed, and it was said that $50 and a silver watch was taken from his body. For some reason, besides the obvious fact that an innocent man lost his life, the people of Mobile became outraged at this crime. I think it was a mix of the brutality of the crime, and it was also the fact that the crime was against like a sick older gentleman, because like I said, at this point in time, Mobile, Alabama was still kind of like a Wild West town. While they had begun to develop into a more civilized, area, there was still like this dark side of Mobile. Duels were still like super common among men to settle disputes, robberies, and other murders, and much more dark shit was still very common during this time period. So it was kind of odd that people were so up in arms for this particular murder, but like I said, it was due to the fact that Nathaniel was an older, sick gentleman, and he was obviously completely innocent. He was just picking blackberries at the cemetery. So, of course, through investigation, it was found out that the last person to see Frost alive was our buddy old pal, Charles R.S. Boyington, the same man who just so happened to have fled town on the same day as his best friend's murder. At this point in time, almost everyone in the town thought that Charles was guilty. People talked about him and about his debts, and like I said, supposedly, even before the murder, they were wondering why Charles and Frost were such good friends to begin with. Newspapers began to post like smear campaigns about Charles, basically saying how horrible of a man he was, and they painted him in a way to show that he befriended Frost for like monetary gain. With a little investigating, authorities figured out how Charles left town. The mayor, John Stocking, yeah, I almost said Stockington, offered a $250 reward for his arrest and another $250 reward for his conviction. And so, now the hunt began. Two men named Joseph Taylor and M. Du Bois were able to actually catch up with the boat in Black Buff, which I think is in Alabama. They were able to get on board and arrest Charles in the ladies' cabin, where he was watching a few men play a card game called Brag. It was said that Charles was surprised when he was arrested for Nathaniel's murder, so much so that he even shouted out, "Murder," when they told him. Like, I don't know if it was like, "Murder," like the old movies. Like, he was just so surprised that he couldn't say anything but kind of like repeat the officers. So he was found with a pocket map, a pocket book, some silver coins, and $95 in notes that belonged to the United States Bank. One of the bills was a $50 bill. Obviously, this will come up later. He was not found with Frost's silver watch at all. He did not have it. So on May 15th, Charles Boyington arrived in Mobile again. Everyone was just so excited to see him. They were so glad he was safe. They thought maybe he was a victim of the murderer too. Just kidding. No. Instead of an excited, happy crowd, Charles basically faced an angry mob. Depending on who you ask, the mob was either simply curious about the supposed murderer, or they were making death threats to Charles on the whole way to the police station. On May 16th, Charles was brought before judges Samuel Garrow and John F. Everett for a preliminary hearing. They appointed Charles 2 lawyers. One was a man named Edward R. Alcott and Isaac H. Edwin. It was said that Edwin was a young but well-connected lawyer, but he wasn't really that well practiced, and there really isn't too much known about Alcott. As we talk about the court case, you will see that these guys may not have been the best lawyers for Charles, but he really had no one, he had no other choice because he couldn't afford a proper one. And whether Charles R.S. Boyington knew this or not, this preliminary trial was a time for him to plead his innocence. At this time, witnesses were brought in to testify for or against Charles. The strongest witness against him was, drumroll please, Captain George, the landlord himself. He was determined to get Charles hung for this murder. It's not known if the captain truly believed he was guilty or not, or if there was another reason he wanted Charles dead. Either way, Captain George testified against Charles Boyington. He was adamant that he had heard the two men discussing going to pick blackberries together. George also remembered that Miss Craigton was sitting on the porch at the time, and he figured that she would corroborate his story as well. It's also worth noting that Charles Boyington also states that he and Frost spoke to Miss Craigton about the blackberries. What's odd, though, is when she herself is questioned, she denies ever being on the porch, and she even denies ever seeing Frost and Boyington. She states that she heard nothing about blackberries. She just denies the whole thing. And honestly, it kind of sounds like she's lying. Two people state that she was on the porch, yet she herself says that she was inside. So, there's two people that are saying you're there, but you're saying you're not. Why would they lie about that, So the next group of witnesses were the 2 lawmen who captured Boyington on the boat. Now, like I said, he was found in the ladies' cabin watching some people play brag. Taylor, one of the men, stated that they had searched Charles in the men's cabin, which that doesn't, ladies' cabin, men's cabin, who knows which one they were in. As they were searching, supposedly they heard a metal clink hit the ground, and suddenly Charles made a kicking motion, setting whatever fell overboard. Supposedly there were other passengers screaming, "A watch, a watch," but according to Taylor, he hadn't actually seen this watch. Later on, when Charles wrote his statement, he said that he had been tied up and had been searched inside of a cabin. So it was basically impossible for him to have any time to toss anything, especially a watch, overboard. Which, and also if you're in a cabin, men's cabin, women's cabin, whatever, you're in a cabin, as far as I know, that's a closed off thing. So you don't have access to an open, edge, if that makes sense. However, during, this whole trial, his lawyers advised him to basically stay silent. And so he did, which obviously isn't the right way to go about this. He should have at least, tried to tell his side of the story, his case of events. But instead, he followed his trusted lawyers, and he held the truth inside. So, while it was true that Charles was not found with Nathaniel's watch, the court went over the rest of his belongings to see if anything that Charles had on him was matched with Frost's stuff. A man named Morrison stated that he had given Frost a $50 bill in change earlier the day of the murder. Well, like I said, it just so happened that Charles had one of those bills, on him, and it was a $50 bill. Now, while that can sound like damning evidence, it should be noted that the $50 note that Charles had on him was from the United States Bank. The one that Morrison had given Nathaniel was a red note, or one that belonged to the Bank of Alabama. This was before like the Civil War and stuff like that. So at the time where most of what we know as America today was still very much divided. So there were two different banks giving out two different types of money. Well, there's more than two, but like Alabama had its own and the United States had its own. So due to the fact that the two $50 bills were technically different, one could say that Charles didn't have Nathaniel's money. While they were trying to figure out if the money was actually stolen, the prosecution also tried to say that Charles had actually stolen Frost's pocketbook. But even that was determined to not be true, as Nathaniel's bag was red, while the one that Charles was carrying was a dark green. So, as it stands right now, they really didn't have any type of evidence to believe that Charles actually did this. All of this supposed evidence they had kind of like fell apart. Really, the only thing that had happened was that Charles Boyington was the last to see Nathaniel Frost alive, and he just decided randomly, quote unquote, to skip downtown conveniently around the time that it happened. At this point, anyone and everyone listening to the evidence was tied. While most didn't really care what Charles had to say, since for the most part they all just wanted to see him hang anyway, there still were people who weren't sure if he was guilty or not. Also, during Joseph Taylor's testimony, he told the courtroom about the conversation that he and Charles had after they arrested him. First, Taylor just kind of watched Charles, was watching his reactions, his tone of conversation, etc. And according to him, Charles wasn't exactly acting guilty. In fact, he was really acting confused, as if he really didn't know that Nathaniel was dead. For a moment, Taylor even wondered if he had the right man. So, he decided to test Boyington just to see what he would say. So first, the lawman bartered with Charles, trading all the money Charles had on him for his freedom. He refused, and so then Taylor began changing tactics, like saying Charles could take $20 and then the lawman would get the rest. Charles still refused. Taylor tried to convince Charles that Frost's money could be proved, which I don't know what exactly that meant. I don't know if that meant that the law could prove that the money Charles had on him was Frost's, or the other way around, that it wasn't Frost's. But either way, Charles agreed with Taylor and said that while the money he had was his, he knew that it would be hard to prove it. So basically, no matter what Taylor said, Charles refused all of his offers to escape. It was said that Charles admitted that he didn't want to come back to Mobile, but not because of the murder, but because of the state of his affairs. He owed a lot of people a lot of money, so of course he didn't want to stick around and wait to be arrested for his debts. But while he didn't want to come back, he wasn't trying to escape police custody. He let the lawman bring him back to Mobile, and now he stood pleading his innocence. When it came to the defense's turn to speak, they had George Williamson, which was Charles's roommate, come in and basically testify about his former roommate's financial trouble. He discussed how Charles was losing money, borrowing too much to the point where he couldn't pay anything back, and at this point he was so scared of his creditors he borrowed money from, so he wanted to leave. George talked about how many conversations the two had shared about Charles's troubles, and while this proved that Charles had other reasons to leave Mobile, it also painted him in a dark light. It also showed that he was possibly so desperate that he could kill. And what really nailed the coffin closed for Charles Boyington was the fact that he was told by his lawyers to stay silent during the meeting. He didn't defend himself at all. He didn't have a chance to tell the court where he got the money or just even his own course of events. He will eventually end up writing a statement while he's in jail, but it would almost be too late to preach his innocence. So, after this preliminary trial, the judges didn't think that the prosecution had enough to convict Charles. So, while they waited for the next grand jury, he was placed in jail. They refused to give him bail since he already tried to flee mobile once after the murder. They were obviously worried that he would try again. The court was also worried about the public's actions towards him if he were to be let out. They were obviously worried about vigilante justice. So Charles headed back to jail, spending his time working with his lawyers and writing poetry for the local newspapers. It was also said that he kept up his secret relationship with Fleur as well, or Rose de Fleur as well. While this time passed, the prosecutors either spent their time finding more evidence or just convincing more people that he was guilty. No matter what was being said about Charles, he did his best to remain calm. He didn't want to make it seem like he was worried about the verdict, as he honestly believed people would eventually see the light and agree that he was innocent. But this kind of actually had the opposite effect on the people of the town, because people began to see his stoic behavior as cold and calculated, that he didn't care that somebody died. And they honestly wondered if Charles was really a madman in printer's clothing. And so that's where we're going to leave you for part 2. I don't think I told anybody or told you guys that this was a 2-parter, but it's a 2-parter because I want to leave a little bit of suspense. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the beginning of this story. It's honestly a really interesting story. We're definitely going to get into it, but I feel like that there were a lot of chances for people to make different steps, and they just didn't. So it kind of, screwed people over, maybe, possibly. So thank you guys for listening. Please be sure to like the video or the episode if you enjoyed it. Comment on YouTube if you think that, at this point, if Charles is guilty or innocent, or just what you think happened in general. And then finally describe. And then finally subscribe if you want to hear part 2 of this story from the Haunted Cafe. Make sure you follow on all of, everywhere that you get podcasts. And thank you guys so much for listening, and we will see you next time. Catch you later.